Welcome to the deep dive. A really significant event this morning. A 6.2 magnitude earthquake struck near Istanbul.
Yes, around 8:30 a.m. local time, and the initial reports are, well, they're quite concerning.
Absolutely. Hundreds injured, widespread damage. We're jumping straight into our analysis of this.
Exactly. We'll look at the immediate aftermath, the geology, which is critical here, and, the potential longer-term effects.
Right. Our goal today is really to give you a clear, concise picture of what's happening, highlight the key information, without getting totally bogged down in every single detail as it emerges.
It's a developing situation, so we need a framework to understand the core issues.
Okay, so let's start right there with the immediate impact. The epicenter was about 60 kilometers southeast of Istanbul,
Yeah, that's relatively close for a major city.
and close enough that the shaking wasn't just felt locally, right? We're hearing Ankara, even parts of Greece.
That's correct. It indicates a fairly powerful release of energy. The waves traveled quite far.
And the human impact. Already at least 150 reported injuries.
Yeah.
That number, it feels like it could easily climb.
Tragically, yes. In the initial hours, as rescue efforts get underway in damaged areas, that figure often rises. It's a grim reality.
Can you sort of paint a picture? A 6.2 quake in a megacity like Istanbul? What does that feel like for people there? The building types are so mixed.
Well, a 6.2 is definitely serious. Within that 60-kilometer radius, you'd get strong, maybe very strong shaking. It's certainly enough to cause considerable damage.
Especially to older buildings.
Exactly. Istanbul has everything from modern high-rises, which might fare better as built to code, to much older, more vulnerable structures. Even moderate damage can mean falling debris, partial collapses.
Leading to those injuries.
Precisely. And the reports of people just fleeing into the streets, that's a completely understandable, instinctive reaction to that level of shaking. Pure panic.
Yeah, that immediate reaction tells its own story. We're seeing these reports. Shattered windows seem common, debris blocking roads.
Cracks in roads, even bridges, apparently.
So it's not just a few buildings here and there. It sounds like the urban landscape itself has been shaken.
It does. And what's particularly striking, maybe worrying, are the reports of damage in the Sultanahmet area.
Right, the historical heart. For listeners, that's where you find Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque. Iconic places.
Iconic and often historically significant structures are, well, built differently. Masonry, older techniques.
So they face unique challenges in a quake.
Absolutely. They can be much more vulnerable than, say, modern reinforced concrete. Repairing them, stabilizing them, that requires specialized conservation work.
Which takes time and money, I imagine, a lot of it.
Significant time and resources. It impacts cultural identity, tourism. It's a major factor beyond just the immediate structural safety.
And beyond the buildings, the transport shutdowns, metro, ferries halted temporarily. That must cause chaos.
Huge disruption. In a city that relies on public transport, even a temporary halt creates massive delays, adds to the stress.
Especially with warnings to stay outside because of aftershocks.
Right. You have people unable to get home, unable to get to loved ones, and being told it's safer outdoors while the ground might still be shaking. It's a very difficult situation.
This really just underscores Turkey's known seismic risk, doesn't it? The North Anatolian fault line looms large here.
It absolutely does. For anyone not familiar, this isn't just any fault line. It's one of the world's most active and potentially dangerous seismic zones.
Can you explain that a bit more? What makes it so significant?
Well, think of it like the San Andreas Fault in California. It's a major strike-slip fault. Essentially, two massive tectonic plates are grinding past each other horizontally.
And that builds up stress.
Immense stress over years and decades, and then suddenly it releases. That releases the earthquake.
And this fault has a history.
A long and devastating history. It's produced a sequence of major earthquakes across Turkey over the centuries. It's a known, persistent geological threat.
So Istanbul's location, right near this fault, it's not a surprise, geologically speaking, that this happens. But the human element, over 15 million people.
Precisely. The proximity to the fault makes the city inherently vulnerable. And the sheer population density means any significant quake has the potential for mass casualties and widespread damage.
Even with modern building codes.
Building codes help enormously for new construction, but enforcing them consistently, retrofitting older buildings, that's a huge ongoing challenge in any city, especially one as old and large as Istanbul. History is a constant reminder of the risk here.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to the response.
Yeah.
We're seeing the Turkish government reactivating emergency plans. President Erdogan making statements.
Standard, necessary first steps. offering condolences, pledging action, mobilizing resources.
But the international reaction is also notable. The EU, the US, Greece, even Greece, given some recent political tensions, offering support.
Yes, and that's quite typical and important in major disasters. Offers of aid often come quickly.
What does that aid actually look like in these first critical hours and days? What's most needed?
Right now, search and rescue is paramount. Finding people trapped in collapsed structures. That requires specialized teams, often international ones with specific gear and dogs.
Urban search and rescue USR teams.
Exactly. Then, immediate medical care for the injured field hospitals might be needed if local hospitals are overwhelmed, and basic necessities. Shelter, clean water, food for those displaced.
So the EU activating its disaster mechanisms, the US and Greek pledges. That could mean rescue teams, medical supplies, maybe financial aid later.
All of the above. The initial focus is life-saving personnel and equipment. Financial aid becomes crucial for supporting the relief effort and then the longer-term recovery. This global response shows recognition of the potential scale of the crisis.
Looking ahead then, the situation is still very much unfolding. We're hearing about aftershocks. How much of a concern are those right now?
They are a significant concern. After a main shock like a 6.2, the Earth's crust needs to readjust. This causes smaller, though sometimes still damaging, subsequent quakes, the aftershocks.
And they can continue for a while.
Oh, yes. They typically decrease in frequency and intensity over time, but they can persist for hours, days, even weeks or longer in some cases.
Which must make rescue work incredibly dangerous.
Extremely. Operating in damaged, unstable buildings is already hazardous. The threat of another shake, even a smaller one, complicates everything and increases the risk to rescue workers.
And keeps the population on edge.
Understandably so. It prevents any return to a sense of normalcy and safety.
So the immediate challenges for Istanbul seem huge. Rescuing survivors, treating the injured, sheltering the displaced. You mentioned overwhelmed hospitals.
That's often one of the first critical bottlenecks. Hospitals dealing with a sudden mass casualty event, possibly with a damage to their own facilities. Setting up temporary shelters quickly is also vital.
The logistics in a city this size must be staggering.
Absolutely monumental. Coordinating everything rescue, medical, aid distribution in such a dense, complex urban environment requires an immense, well-oiled machine. And even the best systems are strained by an event like this.
Thinking longer term, beyond the immediate crisis. An earthquake like this could really change Istanbul, couldn't it?
Profoundly. It tests the resilience of the people, obviously, but also the infrastructure, the economy, the social fabric. It forces a reckoning.
And it puts a spotlight, really, on how other major cities in seismic zones prepare. Or perhaps don't prepare adequately.
That's a crucial takeaway. This isn't just about Istanbul. It's a wake-up call or another reminder for vulnerable cities worldwide. It will likely trigger reassessments of building codes, urban planning, emergency preparedness everywhere.
It has to. The recovery process itself, it'll be long and incredibly complex.
Years, potentially decades, involving massive investment and sustained effort. Rebuilding lives, infrastructure, and confidence.
And finally, you can't ignore the global focus right now. The world is watching Istanbul.
Indeed. There's a shared sense of empathy, I think. A hope for recovery, for the safety of everyone affected.
It really highlights that shared vulnerability we all have to the power of nature.
It does. And the international support, the offers of help, reflect that global solidarity. Hopefully, lessons learned in Istanbul can help other cities become more resilient. Preparedness, infrastructure, response, they're all critical.
So wrapping up our deep dive today, we've seen the immediate chaos following the Istanbul earthquake. We've touched on the geology, the risks that were always there, and the initial local and global response.
It starkly shows the vulnerability of big cities and earthquake zones, and how vital preparedness and international help really are.
And thinking about the recovery for a city like Istanbul, with all its history and complexity, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does it truly take for a major metropolis to rebuild, physically and emotionally, after a shock like this?
That's the core question. And maybe what fundamental changes in how we build and plan our cities are needed before the next one hits, wherever it might be.
A sobering thought indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.